everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to glaze some yarn with brown, which I'm really excited for because I've only really done this once intentionally, and I really want to see how this brown glaze will layer on top of another colorway that I dye, and I think the whole thing will be a lot of fun. Before we jump in though, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Nadine. Nadine, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope you're going to enjoy these color combinations and the yarn that I create from the video. And if you at home would like to learn more about how to become a lab partner, go and check out the listing in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. You get shout outs in an episode of Dyepot Weekly and tell me some colors to avoid, and then I'll dye the yarn base that you picked in a video. And if the lab partner listing is sold out, I do have last minute lab partner options where you can jump in and help bump a video that I've already filmed up the editing queue, and I'll film some last minute shout outs for you. And in the last minute lab partner listing, you can see hints about the technique and the colors already before you sign up. Feel free to reach out to me on Etsy if you have any more lab partner based questions. And Nadine, thank you again for being my lab partner. What is glazing yarn? A yarn glaze is when you get your dyes to strike to the yarn super fast. So you end up with a shallow layer of color just on the surface of the yarn that doesn't even go all the way through the ply. This airbrushed light feel allows you to really see the colorway underneath, and is just like a really rich element that you can bring to the yarn. The goal of the glazing process is to get that layer of color to bind to the yarn really quickly, so that way you get that really shallow penetration of color. And I'll talk more about how we're going to achieve that once we get to the glazing portion of this project. Today, we're going to be dyeing Knit Picks Twill Fingering Weight yarn. This yarn is 100% superwash merino wool. The yarn is really bouncy and has a really high twist, which makes it ideal for glazing because that makes it even easier for colors to just stick to the outside of it. I'm going to go pre-soak 400 grams of this yarn for 30 minutes, at least 30 minutes, in plain tap water with no acid. Because for the first layer that I'm going to apply to the yarn, the first layer of color, I want that to strike a little bit slower than what we're gonna do for our glaze. And so I want to start cold with no acid there. But while we go wait for the yarn to pre-soak, let's go take a look at our colors. My plan is to create a beautiful base color of purple and blue using Dharma acid dyes in hyacinth, alpine blue, and baby blue eyes. And I plan to dye those somewhat randomly over the skeins. We'll see how that goes. But then we're gonna glaze our yarn in some brown, specifically teddy bear brown. And I think this color combination is gonna be really great. I know that these two swatches right here look very similar. There are some more differences, even though they may be a little subtle between those colors. But, well, let's go get started dyeing our base layer. In my catering steam pan, I currently have 8 cups of water, but I think I'm gonna wanna add more. I did not squeeze out all of the water from our pre-soak today because I'm gonna want enough water in here to get reasonable coverage on the yarn, because I wanna add dye powders and then work it through, and honestly, 8 cups may be plenty. I haven't decided if I wanna go for something a little bit more random or a little bit more repeating. I also don't have a yarn mop on hand yet, which I'm regretting a little bit, so I may go grab something. But the main thing I wanted is to be able to push down on our yarn, because then when I have dye powder on here, I can dissolve it in the various areas. For our yarn mop, I have a skein of twill worsted that I just went and quickly wet. This yarn is also 100% superwash merino wool. It's just worsted weight instead of fingering weight. I'm now wearing my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. So we can take some of these dry dye powders and layer them on. I decided we are going for a little bit random. Now, we're not going to end up with speckles. I mean, we could,
but that is not our goal here. And I'm starting with the hyacinth, even though the hyacinth is a color that at first, when I start working it in, it almost disappears. And then it'll reappear with a little bit of time. Sometimes it might need acid, but it is a lovely, lovely purple, even though it's looking gray. And you can even see that one is looking more saturated than everything else. Like, the difference there is pretty extreme. But I started with the color that is the hardest to sort of tell what it's going to be, because then I'll know if I need to add more. And I'm coming in with some baby blue eyes now. And I want to get coverage all over the yarn. I don't want there to be a lot of white left behind, which is also the reason why we're starting with no acid. Look at how pretty this color is. Oh my goodness. I think that baby blue eyes and alpine blue are definitely less pigmented than a lot of the other blues in my collection, which means that it's a little bit easier to add them and spread that color out, to blend and spread it. And if there's too much dye in one spot, I can kind of move that over. So the need for a yarn mop here is not super extreme, and maybe we'll end up dyeing this more in the end, but this is so pretty. Next up is alpine blue, which is definitely related, but I think it's a little less bright than baby blue eyes. And I'm focusing it on the areas that are the most white. But again, we're gonna flip and blend and flip and blend and see where we end up. And it's okay if we're gonna have some areas that are gonna feel a little more pastel overall. And I know, again, that the alpine blue and baby blue eyes are similar. The baby blue eyes is just brighter, which you wouldn't expect from looking at that color swatch. There we go. Hee. Now again, we have no acid in here yet. And that's mainly because I want to be able to spread and blend these colors. But you can see we have a lot of white left. So I'm not about to add acid because I'm still going to want to spread things out more. But I'm enjoying the dimension we get from the two blues. Now, we are going to be adding, I'm adding more hyacinth now, brown on top of everything. So that is going to also sort of add dimension and hues in here. And I doubt in the end we're going to be able to really tell the difference between the two different blues. But you never know. And sometimes I like using colors that are close together but a little different in my projects. Now, see, I added more hyacinth because I was feeling like, oh, things feel really pale. But this is where I get into trouble with this color, especially when starting cold, because it takes a moment. All right, I think, oh, this is so pretty right now. Okay, I think I am going to go ahead and give this like 5 minutes to just sit, and then we'll flip to add color to the other side.
And as for our yarn mop that does not have very much color on it at all yet, I have a feeling I'm going to be using this for another project I'm working on today, and therefore you might see it in the end in the conclusions of that video versus this one, just because there's not that much color on it. But sometimes that's what happens with these mops. They go across multiple videos. I feel like our hyacinth is hyacinthing a little bit more. Awesome! Okay. Now, it's amazing how much colors without adding any acid will start to bind to yarn. But our goal is to, having some pastels are fine, but the goal is to not have this much white in our yarn. So I'm gonna put my respirator mask back on and we'll dye up this other side, making sure that my hands are really dry before I go into one of the dye containers. And then I'm gonna wait about 5 minutes and move the yarn around one more time just to make sure I'm happy with the coverage. And if I need to, I'll add a little bit more dye. All right, I have just finished adding a hair more hyacinth. And now I'm gonna come in with, let's do, why not, 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. And you can see a lot of blues in here. I'm a little nervous our glaze isn't gonna make an impact if this color is too muted and saturated already, but I'm also excited to give this a try. And this tonal layer of whatever we have here is stunning. But now I'm gonna wanna go ahead and heat set it. So I'm gonna bring this over to my stove and heat it for, gosh, I would say maybe 20 minutes. And now say goodbye to the yarn mop because I'll use her for another project, part of another video. Hello, color. I think our hyacinth has taken over a little bit. I'm feeling a very like blue purple here right now. Oh, so pretty. Okay, I am going to set this yarn aside to cool for 2 reasons. One of the reasons why we're setting it aside is that I need to wait for my big dye pot to open up so we can set up the actual brown glaze step. But the other reason why we need to set things aside is that when I glaze yarn, I like it to be cold. And so let me talk a little bit about that. I already told you that when you glaze yarn, you want the colors to strike fast. And 2 things that speed up the rate that colors bind to yarn are heat and acid. And so we are gonna set up our glazing bath with a lot of acid, but I'm gonna do something a little counterintuitive and start with things that are cold. And I know that this doesn't make a lot of sense, but the reason why I'm gonna start the glaze on cold yarn is that I want to be able to get that little amount of dye for our glaze all over the yarn. And sometimes if you have a hot dye bath, high acid, a pigment that you know glazes well, and then you add the yarn to it, that color is gonna strike on the yarn that enters the dye bath first and not end up all over the skein. So I found that the happy medium is to start cold because cold, the diffusion is slower anyway, at least from what I've found. And so if I start with things completely cold and then start heating it after adding the yarn, then we end up getting really good coverage of our glaze. It's still gonna be heavier in some areas and lighter in others, but we're gonna have more of it all over the yarn, and that is my goal. Let's go mix up our brown dye. To prepare for our glazing step, the first thing I needed to do is mix up some brown dye. So I put my Deluxe Rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves on and measured out 1 gram of the Teddy Bear Brown acid dye. I dissolved this in some hot tap water, and I didn't worry about the total volume I was mixing the dye in because we're gonna add 100% of this dissolved dye into our dye bath to make our glaze. Our glazing dye bath has 24 cups of cold water. I'm winging it a little bit, but 400 milliliters of white vinegar. And just for reference, 1 cup of vinegar would be 250 milliliters approximately. I feel like a lot of times I might do closer to 500 milliliters and 32 cups of water. But I did not double check that today, so we're using a little less water. Oh my goodness. Okay, now this is our 1 gram of Teddy Bear Brown dye, which will give us a 1/4 gram of dye per 100 grams of the yarn that we mixed up already. And I'm giving that a really good stir before bringing over our yarn, which just look at those colors. Oh my gosh. We've got a very subtle, here's just 1 skein here, very subtle shifts between the blues and the purple. So it's variegated, but still like not a lot of contrast in there. I am so curious and nervous to put brown over this. Now, one thing that is a little different is we do have acid in our yarn already, which is not usually the case. All right, I'm gonna add the yarn, remove it to move it around once or twice. All right, let's do this. So we're gonna add the yarn in, lift up, put it back down, give it a little wiggle, and let it be. You want to move the yarn a little bit because we want to get coverage, but the more you move the yarn, and especially if you squeeze and release, the more likely you are to help that dye get into the yarn, which is not what we want. But now I'm going to take this over to the stove and heat it up over the span of an hour. The reason that I set the timer for 60 minutes is that even with the heat on medium high, historically it takes around 30 minutes for the pot to heat up to get to a simmer, and then it'll take 30 minutes of heat is what I like to do. So we're just gonna be patient, and I'll see you in about an hour. I'm gonna turn the heat off now. I promise we got to a more vigorous boil at some point in this project. So I feel like around 20 minutes or so we started to get heat. Now these colors are hot. They're warm. I'm trying to get all the zip ties up so I can remove it all at once. Okay. All right, and so this is what I do. The zip ties are not poking out, so it's too hot to bring up. I remove them until those cool off a little bit. Now, I can't tell how glazed this feels. The color is beautiful. The brown with the blue and purple is gorgeous. I do see a little bit of glaze. I think it's subtle. And I think that as I pop this onto a pan, I think it'll be easier to see some more of this once the yarn has cooled off. Certainly though, the colors are really beautiful. And because of the way the brown is layered, there are going to be some areas with less dye still poking through. And so this is going to have a lot of dimension and you're too smoky to really see what's going on. So I'm going to let this cool completely, then we can wash it. Completely cool or mostly cool as I lift this up and the bottom is still warm. You know, it's super wash. It's fine. My job is to give recommendations and then also to tell you when it's okay to break things. It's like, do as I say, not as I do. But sometimes there's 10 minutes before the kids get on their school bus and you want to just finish things up. I am so excited to see this dry. With the brown on top of everything, and there's no color bleeding, but with the brown on top of everything, the yarn is reminding me of dyeing a yak blend. It's like the perfect amount of brown to do that effect. And I used Dawn dish soap today. You can use wool wash or spinner pull or something too. I just use whatever is handy because that is what works well. But anyway, I'm gonna finish rinsing out the soap, and then I'm gonna hang up the yarn to dry, and we'll come back to see a closer look. I don't layer colors with brown very often. I know I've played around with brown as a glaze once before, but a lot of times I think more in terms of like navy and black, which are both cooler toned. But this right now gives me a vibe of dyeing a yak blend that already has like a cool toned brown base. And teddy bear brown is a color that I wouldn't call like a cool toned brown. It's not a super orange brown, but it's also not like a gray brown. It's sort of just more classic brown. Oh man. Let's look closer at the yarn. Because the way that this differs from using a yak blend is that we have this beautiful, beautiful glaze. I'm trying to show it closer, that the color of the brown is so shallow that you feel like you can see those blues and purples beneath it. Oh, this is stunning. The colors we had before we layered on the brown were fairly bright overall, and the brown muted them so nicely. You still feel the purples and you still feel the blues. And gosh, I haven't done a lot of color mixing with brown. I've done a lot of color mixing with not this purple and blue, but with purple and blue and black to get beautiful, more muted tones. But now I'm really wanting to do a lot of those same color mixing exercises with a brown, because I think that that is a great way to mix up some other types of shades that ultimately wouldn't all be more cool toned. They'd have more warmth in them. And if you consider also, if you're mixing a purple with a brown that is more warmer toned, there's yellows in there, you're going to get something that's more neutral than if you mix with a black that is a lot more like blue coated, maybe in some way. I'm not a color expert, but this is making me want to play around with brown dyes a lot more. And I feel like if I was going to give my list of dyes that you should have at your disposal, I recommend like the primaries. You definitely want a cyan, a magenta, a yellow, a true red, a true blue, and a black. But after that, 100% brown is on the list. And it's always been on the list because it's a little harder to mix, but a brown and a navy, I think those would be next on my list of like a starter kit of dyes. And of course I'm saying this where I used hyacinth, baby blue eyes, alpine blue, which are other pre-mixed colors, but you can mix hues that are similar to those starting with primaries. You'll just have to play around with your recipes a bit. When you twist the yarn up, I feel like that glaze pops through really, really well. Nadine, thank you so much for being my lab partner today for this episode of Dyepot Weekly. And thank you also for suggesting this color combination. I think that if I was going to think about a colorway that I wanted to do a brown glaze, I would pick earthy colors to start with. Maybe greens, yellows, orange, and that is where I would lean. And even though I adore the combination of brown and blue and brown and purple, and those are combinations that I do dye up, it's just for the glaze, I don't think brown is where I initially would have like pulled the color. And so I'm so excited with where we are and where we ended up here. So Nadine, thank you again for being my lab partner. Now, as I'm talking about using brown as the glaze over this colorway, I think it would also be really fun to use pink as a glaze over this hyacinth and blue base. Yes, it might not have as much contrast, but I think it would give a dimension that would still be fairly bright overall. And I haven't tried to glaze intentionally with deep magenta yet. I've used pink orchid, that works really well, but deep magenta also can strike really quickly. So I am thinking and planning out other things I want to do in the future. So that means subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I post at least twice a week, and I love to both experiment with new techniques and color combinations, but also revisit and build on other things that I've done in the past. And a lot of times when I'm editing a video and I'm musing about the things to change, I write all that down and then pull from that when I'm planning out other videos in the future. The other place I pull video ideas from are from your suggestions. I screenshot a lot of comments with suggestions, and I have a list that also sometimes I'll just look through to pick out some ideas. And especially when the same suggestion gets commented by multiple people on multiple videos, then that moves things up higher on the list. So yeah, feel free to always ask questions on these videos, but also make suggestions of things you'd like to see. And it's funny because sometimes there might be a suggestion and I might respond. I like to respond to comments when I can. I might respond and say like, oh, why I might not do that. But oftentimes when I do that, then I start thinking about the idea more and more, and then end up doing it at some point or putting it on my list. And so just because at the time I'm not I don't necessarily sound like, oh, I need to go do this right away. That doesn't mean that I'm not gonna do it. If you love the yarn I dye, go check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. There's tons of ready to ship yarn that is already dyed and finished. And there also are sometimes some pre-orders and fun mystery colorways. And so you should go and check that out. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.